Works of Ken Curry. Figures emerge from darkness as if lit by a single lamp. Skin appears thin, almost translucent. Faces are half erased. Coats and gloves catch a narrow beam, while the room behind collapses into black. The spaces feel clinical and ritual at once, quiet interiors where people stand as witnesses to their own fragility. Curry's palette is restrained, iron grays, smoked browns, faint reds. Surfaces look aged, like soot on glass. Nothing is theatrical, the stillness does the work. Ken Curry was born in 1960 in North Shields and grew up in Scotland. He studied at the Glasgow School of Art, graduating in the early 1980s, and became associated with a new generation of figurative painters from the city. From the start, he preferred human presence over scenery, building images through thin layers of oil on linen. Brushwork is hidden, light and shadow carry the emotion. His paintings are compact in tone but expansive in mood, pushing portraits toward states rather than likenesses. Across his career, the subject has narrowed and deepened. Early public commissions in Glasgow looked at workers and civic memory. By the 1990s, the focus turned inward, the body as a site of endurance and change. In 2002, he completed 3 oncologists for the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, 3 medical specialists from Ninewells Hospital in Dundee, shown under cold theater light, poised on the threshold of a dark space. In 2008, he painted Peter Higgs for the University of Edinburgh, a large hushed portrait of the physicist set against a field of near black. More recently, Unknown Man, 2019, entered public display, and his print series Chinakas Namir Bio, The Dead Have Been Seen Alive, first shown in 2022, drew on ancient funerary portraits to study the face as a lasting imprint rather than a likeness. The meaning of these works lies in the boundary between matter and presence. Curry's people are neither symbolic heroes nor everyday types. They are bodies under a lens, seen with a clarity that removes comfort. The spotlight isolates the figure from the world, as if knowledge itself were a kind of exposure. Medical garments, life masks, and neutral rooms become instruments for thinking about time, how a person stands before it, and how the image holds what time erodes. A precise detail reveals the method. For 3 oncologists, Curry could not keep 3 busy specialists sitting together. He made life masks of their faces and spent hours observing procedures to understand how the light falls on fabric, hands, and instruments. For Peter Higgs, the scale and darkness slow the viewer's eye, forcing attention onto small shifts of tone on the face and hands. In the 2022 print series, he looked to the structure of ancient panel portraits, frontal, calm, almost votive, to remove gesture and leave only presence. Taken together, the works form one sustained meditation, people standing in rooms where light is exact and time is heavy. Curry does not dramatize loss, he describes it. The result is a language of quiet intensity, so to images that do not shout, yet stay. Pogo the Clown. The image is bright and grotesque at once. A clown in white grease paint, red mouth exaggerated into a wide grin, blue diamonds framing the eyes, and a pointed red cap. The colors are flat, the brushwork crude, and the background a swirl of cheerfulness that feels hollow. What at first appears playful quickly becomes uneasy. The face is too rigid, the smile too deliberate, the eyes devoid of light. It is not the joyful world of the circus, but a mask that refuses to move. The figure, known as Pogo the Clown, was created not by a professional artist, but by John Wayne Gacy, an American man convicted in the late 1970s of a series of violent crimes. After his imprisonment, Gacy began painting in his cell, producing dozens of works, self-portraits as Pogo, copies of Disney characters, and religious imagery. The paintings were not expressions of artistic innovation, but psychological artifacts, attempts to reclaim identity through image. They were later exhibited, sold, and collected, often surrounded by controversy. In artistic and historical terms, the Pogo paintings belong less to the tradition of fine art and more to the realm of outsider or prison art. Works created outside academic or aesthetic systems, driven by obsession rather than style. Gacy's technique was simple, using cheap oil paints and stencils, yet the result carried an unintentional tension, bright colors masking emptiness. The clown, his own alter ego from years of performing at charity events, became both disguise and confession, an image of forced happiness painted by someone irreparably detached from it. Symbolically, Pogo the Clown stands as an inversion of the archetypal jester. The clown, normally a figure of laughter and exaggeration, becomes here a study in denial, the painted smile as a wall against reality. The repetition of this image across multiple canvases suggests a compulsion, as if the artist were trapped within his own mask. Viewers and collectors later projected meaning onto it, guilt, irony, or even self-punishment. Yet stripped of context, the image is visually banal, unsettling precisely because of its emptiness. A factual note: after Gacy's execution in 1994, his paintings became objects of fascination and disgust. Some were auctioned, others publicly burned by victims' families, and a few were acquired by private collectors or museums studying the psychology of criminal art. Their financial value and notoriety came not from artistic merit, but from the uneasy intersection between art, crime, and the public's appetite for darkness. Viewed through the cold lens of history, Pogo the Clown is not a work of artistic genius but a document, a visual record of how image can mutate into symbol. Its power lies in contradiction, bright colors painted by a man associated with horror. The painting reveals nothing about art's beauty, but much about its danger, how creation, when detached from empathy, becomes a mirror that reflects only void. The Anguished Man. A tortured face emerges from swirling darkness, its features contorted, hollow-eyed, mouth open in a silent cry. The paint is thick and rough. The image seems to have been scraped into existence rather than drawn. Shadows swallow the edges, so the head appears to float in infinite black. The effect is not horror, but anguish made visible. The origins of the Anguished Man are uncertain. According to popular accounts, it appeared in the 1970s or 1980s, later brought to public attention through online stories of a haunted painting. The identity of its creator is unknown, and no credible documentation confirms the legends about its making. The painting's power lies in ambiguity. It has been called cursed, said to produce disturbances or nightmares in rooms where it hangs, but no verified evidence supports these claims. Its status remains between myth and image. Symbolically, the piece works as a raw portrait of pain. Without background or narrative, the anguish becomes its own subject. The distortions, the darkness, the smeared surfaces suggest interior collapse, the moment when consciousness bleeds beyond its boundaries. Technically, the painting seems made with heavy impasto, possibly oil or mixed media over a dark ground. The face is the only area given detail. Everything else recedes into shadow. The effect is confrontation. The viewer meets the pain alone. Today, The Anguished Man is more myth than painting. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the stories we build around images become as powerful as the images themselves. Its emptiness invites speculation. Its anguish demands attention. Brian Charnley's self-portraits. Brian Charnley's self-portraits unfold as a visual record of psychological disintegration, a diary painted in oil, documenting the shifting boundaries between perception and reality. His face appears again and again, always centered, always familiar, yet changing from one canvas to the next. Sometimes calm, sometimes fractured, sometimes covered by strange symbols or shadowy forms. The eyes widen, the mouth disappears, the head splits into mirrored halves. Across the series, the image of the artist becomes a map of his mind, beautiful, precise, and terrifyingly lucid. Brian Charnley was born in 1949 in Northampton, England. He studied at the London College of Printing and later at the Central School of Art and Design. His early work in the 1970s showed strong surrealist influence echoing Dalí and Magritte, but after experiencing severe schizophrenia in his 20s, his art turned inward. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, he began his final project, a sequence of self-portraits created while documenting his mental state in a written diary. Each painting corresponds to an entry describing his symptoms, emotions, and medication, a pairing of image and text that forms one of the most intimate documents of mental illness in modern art. The context of these works is raw autobiography. Painted between 1991 and 1993, the portraits trace Charnley's attempt to express what schizophrenia felt like from within. They were made at a time when he was withdrawing from the outside world, living alone, and painting as both therapy and testimony. The early portraits in the series show his face clearly, rendered with classical precision. Gradually, distortion enters, the skin cracks, symbols multiply, colors darken, and expression dissolves. In the final canvases, the human form barely holds, replaced by abstract lines, scattered eyes, and floating fragments. Symbolically, Charnley's self-portraits reveal the fragile relationship between self-perception and identity. The face, humanity's most recognizable form, becomes unstable, splintered by intrusive imagery. Butterflies, anatomical hearts, and masks appear frequently, representing both metamorphosis and confinement. In one portrait, his mouth is sealed, while insects emerge from his head. In another, the skin peels away to expose thought itself. Charnley used these symbols not as surreal fantasy, but as direct transcriptions of hallucination and delusion, an attempt to make the invisible visible. Technically, his painting is disciplined and deliberate. Even at his most distorted, the surfaces are carefully built with layered glazes and controlled color. The realism of detail makes the distortion more powerful. It feels factual rather than imagined. His palette often mixes sickly greens, bruised reds, and pale blues, the tones of flesh and decay. The background is usually flat and neutral, emphasizing the isolation of the figure. Nothing distracts from the confrontation between viewer and face. An important fact, Charnley kept a written record alongside the paintings, describing his inner experience. After his death in 1991, he took his own life at the age of 40. His twin brother exhibited the series together with the diary, allowing viewers to see the correspondence between thought and image. The final portrait, painted shortly before his death, shows his face shattered into fragments, eyes unaligned, mouth erased, a final silence. Viewed together, Brian Charnley's self-portraits form one of the most direct and courageous statements in modern art about mental illness and identity. They are not symbolic confession, but visual testimony, an artist using the canvas as mirror and measurement of reality slipping away. Each painting is a record of a mind attempting to hold itself together through image. Seen in sequence, they trace the slow disappearance of self-awareness until only form and color remain. In that final reduction, the face turned into pattern. Charnley captured not madness itself, but the unbearable clarity of watching it arrive. Saisaburo cruelly murders Ohagi. A violent scene frozen in woodcut form. A man, sword raised overhead, stands poised over a bound figure whose robes spill beneath her. Her arms are restrained behind her, her body already slumped as life ebbs. The attacker's face is contorted in rage, his posture rigid, muscles taut, the blade about to descend. Lines of motion emphasize the downward thrust. Around them, details, folds of kimono, patterns of cloth, the tension in limbs, sharpen the horror of the act. No background distracts, the figures dominate the space. The artist is Tsukioka Yoshitoshi, 1839-1892, a master of ukiyo-e woodblock prints. He created Saisaburo cruelly murders Ohagi in 1867 as part of his series 28 Famous Murders with Verse, Aime Nijuhashuku. The series depicts sensational crimes drawn from historical events, legends, and kabuki dramas. This work belongs to the genre often called Muzani, cruel pictures, or Chimidoro-e, bloody pictures, images meant to shock, reflect on violence, and warn through visual memory. Historically, Yoshitoshi produced these prints during the Meiji Restoration period in Japan, a time of upheaval, modernization, and cultural contrast. Traditional ukiyo-e was losing patronage to photography and new media, yet Yoshitoshi pushed boundaries. His works retained the craftsmanship of woodblock art while embracing darker, more graphic subjects. The murder depicted here likely comes from kabuki drama, where moral extremes and karmic retribution were common themes. Through his art, Yoshitoshi transformed theatrical narrative into visual indictment. Symbolically, the print confronts the collapse of order through passion. Ohagi, the victim, becomes a symbol of innocence and vulnerability. Saisaburo, wielding the blade, embodies the destructive will unbound by law or reason. The contrast of the attacker's dynamic pull and the victim's passive fall underscores the imbalance of power. Because the background is omitted, the act is decontextualized. It becomes universal violence rather than an isolated story. Yoshitoshi suggests that cruelty does not require setting. It manifests wherever the will overrides humanity. Technically, the woodcut is precise and dramatic. Yoshitoshi used fine line work to show tension in muscles, the flow of robes, and the motion of the blade. The color palette is limited: deep blacks, red highlights, pale flesh tones, and occasional patterning. The composition guides the eye from the raised sword down through the body, from intent to consequence. Despite the brutality, the print retains a stylized clarity characteristic of ukiyo-e, order even in chaos. An interesting fact, in 28 Famous Murders with Verse, each print was accompanied by a short poem, a KU, describing the crime's moral or emotional undercurrent. Yoshitoshi's readers would thus receive image and word together, horror framed by reflection. Through the series, he explored not only the spectacle of violence, but its place in human imagination and memory. Today, Saisaburo cruelly murders Ohagi remains one of Yoshitoshi's most cited works in studies of graphic art and crime imagery. It speaks across time, not as mere shock, but as a visual inquiry into the moment when one human ends another. The blade, lifted in silence, becomes both instrument and question. When does violence begin, and what remains when action has passed? Anxiety. A crowd of people stands on a bridge, their faces pale and mask-like, their dark clothes merging into one continuous wave of black. Behind them stretches a blood-red sky streaked with orange and crimson, the same turbulent horizon that burns across the screen. Beneath the bridge, the water reflects the same fevered light, turning the landscape into a mirror of unease. The figures stare outward, frozen, yet their stillness feels restless, as if they are silently waiting for something that will not arrive. Edvard Munch painted anxiety in 1894, at the height of his psychological period. Born in Norway in 1863, Munch lived much of his life surrounded by illness and death, experiences that shaped his vision of art as the diary of the soul. Anxiety belongs to his famous series, The Frieze of Life, a sequence of paintings exploring the cycle of love, fear, and mortality. If the scream captures one individual's collapse, anxiety shows that same emotion spreading to the crowd, fear made collective. The individual cry has become a social silence. The context of the painting reflects Munch's disillusionment with the modern world. At the end of the 19th century, Norway was entering an age of industrial and social change, yet beneath progress lay uncertainty, the sense that old beliefs and identities were dissolving. Munch's bridge, which appears repeatedly throughout his work, functions as a symbolic threshold between self and society, sanity and despair, life and the void. In anxiety, this crossing becomes permanent. The figures never move forward or back. They exist in suspension, united by an emotion without name. Symbolically, anxiety transforms landscape into psyche. The sky burns not because of sunset, but because the mind is on fire. The fjord and the bridge are painted in rhythmic, flowing lines that echo the pulse of the figure's tension. The repetition of nearly identical faces, hollow-eyed, wax-like, and expressionless, suggests that emotion has become contagious, a shared condition of existence. The colors, reduced to red, black, and ochre, vibrate like nerves under strain. In this world, nature itself seems to reflect human despair. Technically, Munch uses oil on canvas with the loose, trembling brushwork that defines his mature style. His paint is thin, transparent, and unevenly applied, allowing the underlayers to show through, a visual equivalent of fragility. The composition's simplicity conceals careful rhythm. The curve of the shoreline, the slope of the bridge, and the tilt of the figures' heads all guide the eye toward the vanishing point, the same spot where the scream's central figure once stood. This repetition ties both paintings together as two stages of the same vision, one external, one internal. A fascinating detail is how Munch's titles changed over time. Early sketches of this scene were labeled despair and melancholy, revealing that he did not separate these emotions, but treated them as variations of one experience. The red sky, often thought to have been inspired by the volcanic sunsets after the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, became his enduring symbol for inner disturbance, a natural event transformed into psychology. Viewed today, anxiety remains one of the clearest visual expressions of collective dread in modern art. It depicts not an event, but a condition, the paralysis that comes when humanity senses its own fragility. In Munch's world, the landscape no longer comforts, it echoes the mind. The bridge becomes a permanent stage, and the crowd, still and silent, stares back at us with the same expression we might wear when facing the vast, uncertain horizon of existence itself. Le Suicide. A man lies motionless on a bed, his body still in ordinary clothes, a dark jacket, waistcoat, and trousers. One arm rests across his chest, the other hangs loosely toward the floor. A small pistol lies beside him, its metal catching the dim light. The room is simple. A plain wall, a chair, a wooden headboard, and shadows filling the corners. There is no blood, no drama, no witnesses. The moment has already passed. The silence in the painting feels absolute, as if time itself has stopped. Edouard Manet painted Le Suicide around 1877 to 1881 during the final decade of his life. Born in Paris in 1832, Manet was a central figure in the transition from realism to impressionism. His art often challenged social conventions, portraying scenes of modern life with the honesty of observation rather than the polish of idealization. Unlike his earlier, public works filled with urban activity and subtle provocation, Le Suicide is stripped of context. There is no story, no explanation, no moral, only the fact of death, presented with restraint and detachment. The context of the painting remains uncertain. No record identifies the model or the exact inspiration. Some art historians have speculated that the image may have been based on a real event or an anonymous model posing for a study, but Manet left no written account. This absence of narrative contributes to its unease. The work stands apart from the moral or sentimental depictions common in 19th century art. Where others would show despair or redemption, Manet paints only aftermath, emotion reduced to stillness. Symbolically, Le Suicide can be seen as a study of isolation in the modern world. By removing any religious or heroic framing, Manet transforms the scene into an observation of solitude. The man is neither condemned nor glorified, he simply is. The neutral tone of the painting, its subdued color, soft lighting, and lack of expressive gesture, creates an atmosphere of moral ambiguity. The scene could belong to anyone, in any place. In this way, it reflects the disconnection and quiet anonymity that haunted much of Manet's late work. An interesting fact, the painting's refusal to explain itself was considered shocking in its time. The French art world still expected death scenes to carry moral clarity, either warning, sentiment, or redemption. Le Suicide offered none of these. Manet's sparse composition, influenced by photography, showed a reality too direct for comfort. The canvas is small, painted with loose but controlled brushwork, suggesting that it may have been created as a private reflection rather than a public statement. Today, Le Suicide remains one of the most enigmatic images of 19th century realism. It rejects both judgment and sentiment, replacing them with observation. The man's face is calm, the room undisturbed, the act complete. Manet does not moralize or romanticize. He presents existence reduced to its most fragile state, a human presence turned into absence. In its quiet finality, the painting speaks not of despair, but of detachment, the moment when life withdraws and only stillness remains. Anatomical pieces. On a rough table, fragments of the human body lie exposed. A severed arm rests across a cloth, its skin pale and translucent, the hand stiff, veins faintly visible beneath the surface. Nearby, a pair of legs, detached at the thigh, cross one another as if still following the rhythm of life. The background is dark, unadorned, the light concentrated on flesh alone. The atmosphere is silent and clinical, but the brushwork breathes warmth into the cold anatomy. The result is not horror, but an uneasy stillness, the dignity of death observed through the precision of art. Théodore Géricault painted anatomical pieces around 1818 to 1819, during the same years he worked on The Raft of the Medusa. Born in Rouen, France in 1791, Géricault stood at the frontier of Romanticism, an artist who sought truth not through beauty, but through intensity. While preparing for his monumental shipwreck scene, he conducted extensive anatomical studies in hospitals and morgues, driven by the need to understand the human body after life had left it. Anatomical Pieces is one of the few surviving works from that period of research, a private study never meant for exhibition. The historical context gives the painting its weight. Early 19th century France was marked by scientific curiosity and moral conflict over dissection. Anatomical research was central to medical education, yet it remained taboo in popular imagination. Géricault, who had trained briefly under the classical painter Pierre Narcisse Guérin, defied convention by making the dissected body his subject, not hidden, not symbolic, but real. He turned what was considered repulsive into a meditation on human fragility and the thin line between science and empathy. Symbolically, Anatomical Pieces merges anatomy and morality. The detached limbs do not evoke violence, but transience. The pale, luminous flesh contrasts with the surrounding darkness, suggesting that the body itself is both object and memory. What remains when the self is gone? Géricault's choice to focus on fragments rather than the whole form reveals his intent to separate identity from flesh, to study mortality as structure rather than event. In this balance of realism and restraint, he transforms decay into observation and observation into reverence. A fascinating fact, Géricault's friends and biographers described how he kept human remains in his studio while working on The Raft of the Medusa. He obtained them, with permission, from Parisian hospitals, sketching them in different stages of decomposition to capture color and texture accurately. The studies horrified his contemporaries, but fascinated later generations, who recognized in them an early example of the artist confronting the truth modern society preferred to ignore: that the human body, in death, is still a work of form and mystery. Today, Anatomical Pieces is preserved in the Musée Fabre in Montpellier. It stands not as a morbid curiosity, but as a cornerstone of romantic realism, a painting where observation becomes philosophy. Géricault's brush does not sensationalize, it dignifies. The severed limbs, bathed in quiet light, become symbols of both mortality and persistence. In their silence lies the central paradox of his art, that by painting death with such precision, he revealed more vividly than anyone the living truth of being human. Hide and seek. At first, the painting appears to show children playing in a forest. Small figures crouching, climbing, or half hidden among trees. But as the eye adjusts, the scene begins to change. The trunks twist into bones, the leaves resemble veins and nerves, faces emerge from the bark and disappear again. A girl stands at the center, pale and radiant, her body formed from intersecting lines of roots and light. Around her, the entire forest seems to breathe as one organism. The more you look, the less clear the boundaries become between children, trees, and air. Pavel Chilichou completed Hide and Seek in 1942 after nearly a decade of work. Born in Moscow in 1898, he fled Russia after the revolution, moving first to Berlin, then Paris, and finally to the United States. A painter of extraordinary technical skill, Chilichou combined surrealism, symbolism, and anatomical precision into a single vision. By the time he began this painting, he was living in New York, haunted by memories of exile and fascinated by the hidden geometry of human life, how nature and anatomy could mirror one another. The context of hide and seek is both personal and historical. Painted during World War II, when much of the world was collapsing, the work represents a search for order within chaos. The image's surface, luminous and peaceful, conceals layers of psychological and spiritual meaning. Chilichu's fascination with transformation and metamorphosis drives every part of the composition, trees becoming veins, children becoming spirits, the earth itself turning into a body. The game of hide and seek becomes a metaphor for existence, the search for self within the endless cycle of growth and decay. Symbolically, the painting merges childhood innocence with cosmic unity. The girl at the center, both child and symbol, embodies the soul in transition, visible and invisible, rooted and ascending. Her form radiates light, connecting the hidden figures that populate the forest around her. The intertwining branches and limbs suggest that life is not divided, but continuous, each part reflecting the structure of the whole. Chilichu's intricate layering of faces and forms transforms the canvas into a living anatomy of the world, part play, part revelation. Technically, hide and seek demonstrates Chilichu's mastery of complex structure and transparent color. He used multiple glazes of oil paint to achieve depth, allowing the figures to emerge gradually from one another. The palette shifts between luminous greens, browns, and silvers, illuminated by the pale glow of the central figure. The sense of space is paradoxical, infinite yet compressed, like a vision contained within the human mind. The painting measures nearly 2 meters tall and dominates its viewer, demanding close attention to detail and distance alike. An interesting fact, hide and seek was immediately recognized as Chilichu's masterpiece when exhibited in 1942 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where it still resides. Critics at the time were divided. Some praised its visionary synthesis of anatomy and landscape, while others found it unsettling and obsessive. Over time, it came to be seen as one of the most ambitious symbolic paintings of the 20th century, bridging surrealism and mysticism. Viewed today, hide and seek feels less like a scene than a living system, a meditation on the unseen patterns that connect body, nature, and spirit. It transforms a child's game into a cosmic equation, hiding as the act of creation, seeking as the act of understanding. In Chilichu's forest, everything hides and everything reveals, the endless search for the self reflected in the structure of the world. Pyramid of skulls. 4 skulls are arranged on a flat surface, stacked in a loose pyramid against a neutral background. The light is dim, angled sharply from above, leaving deep shadows beneath the bones. The skulls are not clean or symmetrical. They are worn, yellowed, and irregular, their empty eye sockets turned toward the viewer. There is no ornament, no symbolic prop, no landscape. The simplicity is deliberate, life reduced to form, color, and texture. The silence around them feels heavy, as if the air itself has stopped moving. Paul Cézanne painted Pyramid of Skulls between 1901 and 1906 in the final years of his life. Born in Aix-en-Provence in 1839, Cézanne is best known as the painter who bridged Impressionism and Modernism, translating the world into geometric structure and pure perception. But in his last decade, as his health declined, his art turned inward. The bright landscapes and still lifes gave way to quieter, darker meditations. Among the many skull studies he painted during this time, Pyramid of Skulls stands as the most concentrated, not decorative, but existential. The context behind the work reflects the painter's awareness of mortality. Cézanne lived in near isolation in Aix, withdrawn from Paris and the art world that had finally begun to recognize him. Friends and visitors described his studio filled with skulls, real ones he had collected from anatomy studies decades earlier. They served not as memento mori in the traditional sense, but as tools of structure and reflection. In this solitude, Cézanne confronted the same subject he had always painted, the arrangement of objects in space, but now stripped of life, reduced to permanence and decay. Symbolically, Pyramid of Skulls is less a vanitas than an inquiry into existence. The skulls form a geometric composition, 2 at the base, 1 between, 1 above, a structure of balance and tension. Yet their rough texture, the broken edges and uneven light, suggest the instability beneath order. Cézanne transforms mortality into form, treating death not as tragedy, but as part of the physical world's construction. The skulls are as solid and as real as apples or stones in his earlier still lifes. The difference is not what they are, but what they mean. Technically, the painting reveals Cézanne's mastery of the late style that would define modern art. He uses thick, visible brushstrokes and muted tones, ochres, whites, grays, and blues, creating a rhythm of surface and depth. The shadows build structure rather than atmosphere. The skulls seem sculpted from paint itself. The light does not reveal, it isolates, a reminder that even perception is temporary. Each skull becomes a study of volume and weight, a painter's contemplation of matter and impermanence. A revealing fact, Pyramid of Skulls was never exhibited in Cézanne's lifetime. Discovered after his death in 1906, it was understood as his final meditation, not a religious or moral warning, but a personal acknowledgement of the body's end. Letters from that period reveal his growing obsession with time. "I am becoming the primitive of a new art," he wrote, "but death is approaching." The painting, finished only months before he collapsed during a rainstorm, feels like an unspoken farewell. Today, Pyramid of Skulls stands as one of the most powerful and understated images of mortality in modern art. It strips away narrative, leaving only presence. 4 objects, 4 echoes of what once was human. Through them, Cézanne found clarity rather than despair, the realization that form endures even as life fades. In their stillness, the skulls contain his final lesson, that art, like existence, is built from matter, light, and silence. Heads of torture victims. 2 human heads rest on a plain surface, illuminated by a faint directional light that cuts through darkness. The faces are slack, the flesh discolored, the eyes closed. One head tilts forward, mouth half open. The other lies on its side, framed by short, matted hair. The background is black, absorbing all trace of setting or narrative. The composition is quiet, almost reverent. The viewer is left face to face with mortality, stripped of story and sentiment. Théodore Géricault painted Heads of Torture Victims around 1818 to 1819, while preparing his monumental work, The Raft of the Medusa. Born in Rouen, France in 1791, Géricault was among the first artists of the Romantic generation to confront reality directly, unidealized, unembellished, and psychologically raw. During his studies for The Raft, he sought to understand the visual truth of death, anatomy, and decay, spending long hours in Paris hospitals and morgues. These anatomical studies, as he called them, were never meant for exhibition. They were exercises in understanding the physical and emotional structure of the human body. The historical context gives the work its power. In early 19th century France, medical science and art were both redefining their boundaries. Anatomy was studied with new precision, but public fascination with the human body after death remained taboo. Géricault bridged these worlds. He treated the body not as a spectacle, but as a fact of existence. The heads in this painting, likely those of executed criminals provided by hospital staff, were observed and painted in the artist's studio. He worked quickly, with thick, tactile brushstrokes, capturing the shifting colors of decomposing flesh before they changed. Symbolically, Heads of Torture Victims transcends its morbid subject. It is not about violence or cruelty, but about observation and empathy. The absence of any visible injury emphasizes stillness over suffering. Light falls softly across the faces, giving them an almost sacred quality, like relics or witnesses rather than objects. The piece reflects Romanticism's deep interest in human fragility, not as spectacle, but as truth. Géricault's realism refuses to moralize. He paints the end of life as part of the same order as its beauty. An interesting fact, several of Géricault's studies of severed heads and limbs were discovered after his death in 1824 and kept privately by collectors who recognized their technical and psychological depth. Long hidden for their perceived indecency, they later came to be seen as the first modern meditations on mortality, works where science, art, and philosophy converge. Their directness influenced later artists such as Courbet and the Symbolists, who saw in them the courage to depict what society preferred to ignore. Today, Heads of Torture Victims is regarded not as pathology, but as vision. It captures the point where Romanticism meets realism, emotion contained within observation. The darkness surrounding the faces is not horror, but silence. In that silence, Géricault transforms the remains of violence into something contemplative, almost eternal. What endures is not death, but the painter's gaze, precise, unflinching, and profoundly human. The Mouth of Hell, Getty Tondal. A monstrous face fills the lower half of the painting, its mouth wide open, its lips curled like the gates of a furnace. Inside, fire glows red and gold, lighting the writhing figures of the damned who fall into the creature's throat. Claws, teeth, and serpents frame the entrance. Human forms twist amid flame and smoke, their gestures frozen in silent terror. Around this infernal mouth stand angels, demons, and architectural fragments of heaven and hell, separated by a boundary of light. The image is both detailed and contained, a miniature apocalypse rendered with precision and calm. This scene, known as The Mouth of Hell, comes from the Getty Tondal manuscript, an illuminated vision of the night Tondal produced around 1475 in Bruges for Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy. The artist was Simon Marmion, a leading painter and manuscript illuminator of 15th century Flanders. Marmion, active in Valenciennes and Amiens, was celebrated by his contemporaries as the Prince of Illuminators. His works combine northern realism with spiritual imagination, turning moral allegories into vivid architectural spaces. The manuscript illustrates The Vision of the Knight Tondal, a popular medieval tale describing the journey of a sinful knight through hell, guided by an angel. It belongs to the same visionary tradition as Dante's Inferno, a moral guidebook painted in images. In this specific miniature, Marmion depicts the moment when Tondal beholds the mouth of hell, the great beast that devours souls. The composition follows medieval iconography. The jaws of a gigantic monster symbolize the gateway to damnation, a living landscape of punishment. Symbolically, the mouth of hell represents the idea of sin as consumption, the world devouring those who succumb to its temptations. The monstrous mouth, with its layered teeth and fiery interior, is not just an image of horror, but of structure, order turned against itself. Marmion's painting bridges fear and precision. Every detail, from the scales of the creature's lips to the small golden flames, is rendered with jewel-like clarity, reminding the viewer that even terror can be organized by faith and art. The presence of the guiding angel, often standing at the edge of the scene, provides the contrast, purity and damnation coexisting in a single frame. Technically, the illumination exemplifies late Burgundian refinement. Marmion used tempera and gold on vellum, combining tiny controlled brushstrokes with delicate glazes to create depth within the miniature's few centimeters. The fire inside the creature's mouth is built from thin layers of translucent red and orange, glowing like enamel. The structure of the jaws, arched like church vaults, echoes the Gothic architecture familiar to Marmion's audience, turning hell itself into a perverse cathedral. A fascinating detail, in the Getty Tondal, the scene of the mouth of hell was placed opposite one of paradise, emphasizing symmetry. The same composition mirrored in light and shadow. The manuscript was later acquired by the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, where it remains one of the finest surviving examples of 15th century Flemish illumination. Its condition is remarkably intact. The pigments still retain their brightness after 5 centuries. Viewed today, the mouth of hell, Getty Tondal, stands as both warning and wonder. It captures the medieval imagination at its most disciplined, terror made precise, damnation rendered beautiful. In Marmion's vision, hell is not chaos but design, a perfect machine where sin meets consequence, and every line of gold and flame serves to remind the viewer of the order behind the abyss. Deterioration of mind over matter. A skull floats at the center of the composition, half consumed by what appears to be a cage of bone and metal. Strands of tissue cling to the bone like cobwebs. The jaws open slightly, the expression neither alive nor dead, suspended between thought and decay. Around it, the background dissolves into blackness, with only faint traces of red and brown, the colors of rust, flesh, and soil. The entire image feels fragile, as if the skull itself is collapsing under its own weight. This painting was created in 1973 by Austrian artist Otto Rapp, known for his surreal and symbolic explorations of the human condition. His art from this period often combined anatomical precision with dreamlike transformation, portraying the mind as both architecture and ruin. Deterioration of mind over matter became one of his most recognizable works, an emblem of spiritual erosion rendered with the detail of scientific observation. The context of the work lies in the post-surrealist movement of the 1970s, when European artists were turning inward, seeking metaphysical meaning through the human body. Rapp, influenced by the Vienna school of fantastic realism, used hyper-realistic technique to explore the limits of consciousness. In this painting, he presents the skull not as a symbol of death, but as a vessel of thought breaking down. The deterioration is not physical alone. It is the slow collapse of order, the moment when reason begins to surrender to entropy. The symbolism is layered and precise. The skull represents intellect, the seat of awareness. The enclosing structure around it is matter, rigid, confining, and inescapable. The tension between the two forms creates a visual equation. Mind attempts to transcend, but matter pulls it back into decay. The thin wires, pins, and bone-like supports suggest that consciousness is mechanical, held together by fragile design. Flesh, meanwhile, slips away, the evidence of life fading, leaving only structure. Technically, Rapp painted the work in acrylic with near-photographic detail. His use of subtle gradients and polished surfaces gives the illusion that the skull is lit from within. The textures, soft tissue, corroded metal, brittle bone, are rendered with almost scientific precision. Yet the realism does not comfort. It amplifies unease. The closer one looks, the more the image appears to move, as if the boundaries between matter and thought were melting in real time. Viewed today, deterioration of mind over matter remains one of the most haunting visual meditations on mortality and identity in modern visionary art. It captures the point where intellect turns inward and consumes itself, where the human mind, once master over matter, begins to fragment under its own reflection. The result is not horror, but inevitability, the quiet end of control, when the mind finally recognizes that it too is made of flesh. Diomedes being eaten by his horses. In the center of the painting, a man is torn between beauty and violence. His body, pale, muscular, and luminous, twists backward as two horses rear above him, their teeth sinking into his flesh. The animals are painted with a strange elegance, their eyes wide, manes flowing like fire, bodies sculpted in light. Around them stretches a barren, red-toned landscape, filled with scattered bones and shadowed ruins. The sky glows with the dim color of dawn or flame, turning the scene into both a myth and a vision. Gustave Moreau painted Diomedes being eaten by his horses around 1865. Born in Paris in 1826, Moreau became one of the central figures of French symbolism, an artist who replaced historical realism with allegory and dream. He studied classical mythology throughout his career, transforming its stories into psychological theater. This particular subject, drawn from the legend of Hercules, shows the punishment of Diomedes, a Thracian king known for feeding his enemies to his own horses. When Hercules forced him to face the same fate, the story became an image of justice turning inward, cruelty consuming its source. The context of the painting reflects Moreau's lifelong fascination with the moral dimension of myth. Rather than show the moment of punishment as raw horror, he turned it into an image of transcendence. The violence is stylized, the blood almost decorative, the gestures frozen like ritual. In the contrast between human flesh and animal power, Moreau found his central theme, the collapse of intellect before instinct, of civilization before its primal core. The painting, therefore, is not simply a scene of vengeance. It is a vision of human arrogance devoured by its own nature. Symbolically, Diomedes being eaten by his horses embodies the duality that defines Moreau's art, beauty and decay bound together. The horses, rendered with divine energy, represent instinct unrestrained, the untamed force of life and desire. Diomedes, painted with the idealized anatomy of classical sculpture, stands for order, pride, and control. The union of the two, man and beast, victim and instrument, becomes a visual metaphor for self-destruction. Moreau often used myth to explore the idea that human reason and animal instinct are inseparable halves of the same being. Technically, the painting demonstrates Moreau's mastery of texture and color. He built his images through layers of thin oil glazes, giving them a luminous, almost enamel-like surface. His palette, golds, reds, and greens, vibrates with tension, creating light that seems to come from within the figures. The composition is circular, drawing the viewer's eye back again and again to the intertwined bodies, suggesting that punishment, like desire, is cyclical and eternal. An interesting fact, Moreau returned to this subject several times, both in paintings and in preparatory sketches, each emphasizing a different psychological nuance. Some versions show the act of devouring more directly. Others dissolve into abstraction, focusing on gesture and color rather than anatomy. The recurring theme of devourment, body consuming body, became one of Moreau's visual obsessions, appearing also in his depictions of mythic women and fallen gods. Viewed today, Diomedes being eaten by his horses stands as a quintessential example of symbolist vision, where myth is not narrative but reflection. It is less a scene of cruelty than a meditation on consequence. The ruler undone by his own appetite, the thinker consumed by what he believed he controlled. In Moreau's world, beauty and destruction are never opposites. They are the same act, seen from different sides of the flame. The Dead Mother. A small girl stands in the foreground of a dim room, her hands pressed tightly against her ears. Her eyes are wide, shocked, unblinking, and filled with something beyond comprehension. Behind her lies the motionless body of a woman on a bed, her face pale against the white pillow. Around the bed, shadowy figures gather in grief, their forms blurred and indistinct, as though fading into the air. The walls of the room lean inward, the space compressed, suffocating. The entire scene feels suspended in a moment that refuses to end, a single second stretched into eternity. Edvard Munch painted The Dead Mother between 1899 and 1900, revisiting a memory that had haunted him since childhood. Born in 1863 in Luton, Norway, Munch lost his mother to illness when he was only 5 years old. Her death marked him permanently and became a recurring subject in his art. This painting is one of several he made on the same theme, blending personal trauma with symbolic vision. Like the scream or anxiety, it belongs to Munch's cycle, the frieze of life, in which he sought to depict the major emotional states of existence: love, fear, sickness, and death. The context of the painting reflects Munch's belief that art should express psychological truth rather than external reality. At the turn of the century, he was deeply involved with symbolism and early expressionism, rejecting the polished surfaces of academic art. His goal was not to describe death, but to translate its effect on the mind, the disorientation, silence, and horror of a child suddenly aware of mortality. The distorted perspective and flattened color serve that purpose. The room seems to close in on the girl, and the surrounding figures dissolve, leaving her alone in a world that has lost its center. Symbolically, the work captures the moment when innocence encounters death for the first time. The girl, perhaps Munch's childhood self, covers her ears to block out both sound and understanding, a futile attempt to protect herself from the reality behind her. Her red hair and dress mirror the warm tones of the bedspread, linking her to the mother she cannot save. The whiteness of the sheets and pillow symbolizes both purity and absence. In this space, color replaces narrative. The contrast between red and white, life and emptiness, becomes the emotional core of the scene. Technically, Munch uses oil on canvas, with loose, almost trembling brush strokes. The paint seems unstable, as though the image itself might fade. The heavy outlines of the figures and the lack of firm perspective evoke the sensation of a dream or memory, distant yet unbearably clear. The child's direct gaze breaks the boundary between painting and viewer, confronting us with the same incomprehension she faces. An important fact: the dead mother was first shown publicly in 1901 and met with mixed reactions. Some viewers were disturbed by its intensity. Others recognized it as one of Munch's most psychologically direct works. Over the years, it has become one of his defining images of grief, not dramatic, but silent and interior. The painting now resides in the National Gallery in Oslo. Viewed today, the dead mother remains one of the most unsettling representations of loss in modern art. It does not depict the moment of death itself, but the echo it leaves behind, the paralysis of those who remain. Through the eyes of the child, Munch transforms personal memory into universal truth, the realization that death is not an ending, but a presence that stays in the room long after the body has gone. The Devil, Codex Gigas. On the right-hand page of an enormous medieval manuscript stands a single figure, the Devil, drawn in ink and pigment on parchment. His body fills the page completely, framed by two tall towers painted in muted gray. His face is wide and animal-like, eyes large and staring, tongue extended, mouth grinning with sharp white teeth. His body is covered in dark fur, his hands and feet end in claws, and two small horns emerge from his head. The background around him is pale, leaving the figure suspended in emptiness. There is no landscape, no victims, no flames, only the creature himself, isolated, powerful, and silent. This image appears in the Codex Gigas, a massive 13th century manuscript created in Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic. Measuring almost a meter tall and weighing over 70 kilograms, it is the largest surviving medieval book. According to legend, it was written by a monk named Herman the Recluse in the Benedictine monastery of Podlajice around the year 1229. The manuscript contains the entire Latin Bible along with medical texts, chronicles, and magical formulas, a compendium of medieval knowledge. But what made it legendary was this one image, a full-page portrait of the devil, placed alone opposite another page depicting the heavenly city. The context of the work is shaped by both fact and legend. The Codex Gigas, literally giant book, was produced at a time when manuscripts were copied by hand over years or decades. The myth says that Herman, condemned for a grave sin, promised to write a book containing all human knowledge in one night to atone for his guilt. Realizing it was impossible, he prayed not to God but to the devil, who granted him help in exchange for his soul. In gratitude, the monk is said to have added the devil's portrait to the book. While historians see this as a later story, the placement of the image, so large, so direct, so alone, gives the legend its enduring power. Symbolically, the devil in the Codex Gigas is not monstrous in motion, but in presence. His stance is rigid, symmetrical, and formal, more like an icon than a narrative figure. He is depicted not as the ruler of chaos, but as its embodiment, confined within the page, yet eternal within it. The gray towers around him act as a kind of prison or frame, separating him from the rest of creation. The artist, whether Herman himself or another monk, gave the devil a body both grotesque and human, suggesting temptation not as an outside force, but as something built into the structure of the world. Technically, the image is executed in tempera and ink on vellum. The precision of the line and the limited palette, earth tones, green, red, and black, reflect the strict monastic discipline of medieval illumination. The colors have faded with time, but the devil's form remains strikingly intact. Scholars note that his claws and posture resemble depictions of mythic beasts from earlier manuscripts, blending Christian theology with older, European, and Near Eastern imagery. An interesting fact, the Codex Gigas survived centuries of war, fire, and theft. It was taken as spoils by Swedish forces in 1648 during the 30 Years' War and remains today in the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm. The book's legend as the Devil's Bible endures, though modern analysis confirms it was written by a single scribe over decades, a feat of discipline, not magic. Viewed today, the Devil, Codex Gigas, stands as one of the most haunting images of the medieval imagination. It reveals how fear and fascination with evil were balanced by structure and control, the monster confined within the book, the chaos bound by order. The devil does not act, he waits. His gaze, fixed and eternal, reminds the viewer of the silent presence of darkness that medieval faith sought to contain through the written word itself. The ghost of a flea, a small muscular creature, stands in near darkness, its skin a mixture of bronze and shadow. It has the body of a man, powerful shoulders, sinewy arms, but the elongated head and tongue of an insect. Its mouth opens as if hissing or whispering. In one hand, it holds a cup as though offering it to an unseen presence. In the other, it carries a small blood-filled shell. The background glows faintly with gold and brown light, where stars flicker like sparks. The figure seems both monumental and miniature, poised within a vision that feels more dream than reality. William Blake painted The Ghost of a Flea around 1819 to 1820, one of his most mysterious works. Born in London in 1757, Blake was a poet, engraver, and visionary, an artist who claimed to see spiritual beings as vividly as the physical world. According to contemporary accounts, he created this painting after claiming that the spirit of a flea appeared to him during a seance-like vision. The being, he said, told him that all fleas were inhabited by the souls of men consumed by bloodlust. Blake painted what he saw, combining natural observation with mystical revelation. The context of the painting belongs to Blake's late period, when he was working in isolation, misunderstood by the mainstream art world. His visionary approach to creation, blending theology, mythology, and imagination, had moved far from academic norms. He worked not to depict nature, but to reveal the unseen forces behind it. In The Ghost of a Flea, the insect becomes a symbol of human vice, desire stripped of reason, appetite without compassion. The ghost is not a spirit of the dead, but the living essence of cruelty made visible. Symbolically, the painting compresses Blake's philosophy into one image. The flea's human form embodies the fusion of the spiritual and the material, the eternal trapped in corruption. The cup in its hand resembles a chalice, turning the creature into a parody of religious ritual, a communion of blood rather than wine. Its massive body within a tiny space reflects excess and confinement, greed too large for its container. The flickering light behind it, produced with thin layers of gold and varnish, suggests both revelation and decay, enlightenment poisoned by obsession. Technically, The Ghost of a Flea was painted in tempera and gold leaf on a small panel, only about 21 by 16 centimeters. Despite its size, the figure dominates the composition as if it were monumental. The texture of the paint, combined with Blake's delicate engraving-like lines, gives the surface an otherworldly shimmer. The darkness of the background isolates the being, making it appear as though floating between worlds. An interesting fact: Blake's friend, the astrologer John Varley, recorded the moment of the vision in his notebooks, describing how Blake saw the flea standing before him and immediately began sketching it. The resulting painting became part of a small group of works depicting spiritual apparitions. While many contemporaries dismissed these visions as delusion, later generations recognized in them the foundation of Blake's symbolic language, his belief that imagination was a form of truth higher than reason. Viewed today, The Ghost of a Flea stands as one of the most intimate expressions of visionary art. It transforms the smallest of creatures into a monument of inner darkness. The painting does not frighten, it fascinates. It invites the viewer into the world as Blake saw it, where every living thing, even a flea, contains an immortal spirit, and where imagination alone can reveal what hides behind the veil of matter. The Racetrack, Death on a Pale Horse. A ghostly horse gallops through darkness, its rider skeletal and cloaked, carrying a scythe that glimmers faintly in the dim light. Around the edges of the canvas, a circular racetrack fades into the gloom, its boundaries barely visible. A single human figure lies fallen in the dirt, a jockey, motionless beneath the shadow of the horse. The landscape is barren, with only a low horizon and a sky the color of ash. The painting feels more like a vision than a scene, as if the world has been stripped of sound and time, leaving only motion and echo. Albert Pinkham Ryder painted The Racetrack, Death on a Pale Horse, around 1896 to 1908, near the end of his life. Born in Massachusetts in 1847, Ryder became one of America's most distinctive visionary painters, a solitary figure who rejected realism for poetic symbolism. His canvases are small but dense, layered with dark varnishes that make them appear almost sculpted. The racetrack stands among his final and most haunting works, embodying the romantic fascination with death, fate, and moral reckoning. The context of the painting's creation is tied to an incident that profoundly affected Ryder. According to accounts from his friends, he once heard of a jockey who, after betting against himself, lost his race and took his own life. The story obsessed him. To Ryder, it became more than a tale of despair. It was an allegory for spiritual ruin, for the soul defeated by its own choices. In the painting, the track becomes the circle of human existence, a closed path where every life runs its race toward the inevitable finish. Symbolically, the racetrack, Death on a Pale Horse, draws directly from the imagery of the Book of Revelation, where death rides a pale horse followed by the forces of the grave. But Ryder transforms this biblical vision into something intimate and American. The racetrack, a modern arena of risk and greed, replaces the battlefield or the apocalypse. Death is not triumphant, he is inevitable, part of the motion of the world. The fallen jockey, faceless and alone, represents the cost of pride and chance, while the circular track suggests repetition, the endless race that all beings run. Technically, Ryder's method gives the painting its distinctive aura. He applied paint in thick, semi-transparent layers, each separated by varnish, creating depth through accumulation rather than clarity. The result is a surface that seems to glow from within, like moonlight trapped under glass. His dark palette, ochres, greens, and blacks, hides subtle shifts of light that only appear with prolonged viewing. Over time, the varnishes have darkened, intensifying the painting's atmosphere of decay and mystery. A fascinating detail, Ryder included in the foreground a small serpent coiled along the inside of the racetrack, barely visible in the shadows. It represents sin, temptation, or perhaps the eternal presence of corruption that guides the race. This small symbol transforms the image from simple tragedy into cosmic parable, man, death, and temptation locked in a circle without end. Today, the racetrack, Death on a Pale Horse, is housed in the Cleveland Museum of Art and remains one of Ryder's most studied works. It encapsulates his lifelong pursuit of the unseen, emotion expressed through form, spirituality rendered through darkness. The painting's silence and simplicity conceal vast meaning, a meditation on the inevitability of fate and the futility of human defiance. In Ryder's vision, death is not a punishment, but a law of motion, the final rider, always on the track, waiting for us to pass. The Great Red Dragon and the Beast from the Sea. A winged creature towers over a chaotic, apocalyptic sea. Its body is immense, muscular and luminous, covered in scales that glimmer red and gold. 7 heads rise from the waves below, each crowned and snarling, their necks twisting like serpents. Above them, the great red dragon spreads his wings to their full span, dominating the sky. His arms extend outward in a cruciform pose, his back arched in tension. Around him, the air glows with unnatural light. Not sunlight, but the radiance of vision. The scene is both beautiful and terrifying, caught between revelation and nightmare. William Blake painted The Great Red Dragon and the Beast from the Sea around 1805 to 1810 as part of a series of watercolor illustrations for the Book of Revelation. Born in London in 1757, Blake was a poet, engraver, and painter who worked largely in isolation, creating an intensely personal fusion of art, religion, and philosophy. The Red Dragon series, which includes The Great Red Dragon and the Woman clothed with the sun, and the number of the beast is 666, was his most powerful interpretation of biblical prophecy. These works are not illustrations in a literal sense, but spiritual dramas, visions of good, evil, and transformation staged within the imagination. The context of the painting is the apocalyptic vision of Revelation 12 and 13, in which the dragon, representing Satan, rises to wage war against heaven and unleashes the beast from the sea. For Blake, this was not merely religious allegory. He saw in these passages the eternal struggle between the creative and the destructive forces within human consciousness. The dragon, magnificent yet fallen, embodies energy without moral direction, the raw power of imagination corrupted by domination. The beast from the sea, with its crowns and monstrous heads, represents earthly tyranny, the institutions that enslave spiritual freedom. Symbolically, the great red dragon and the beast from the sea distills Blake's vision of duality, the sacred and the demonic, the divine imagination and the false order of the material world. The dragon's cruciform pose echoes Christ's, a deliberate inversion that blurs the boundary between divine sacrifice and satanic pride. Blake presents evil not as chaos, but as perverted symmetry, beauty turned inward on itself. The brilliance of the dragon's wings and the radiance of his body reveal the same creative fire that fuels both heaven and hell. Technically, Blake used watercolor and ink on paper, combining transparent washes with sharp contour lines to achieve both delicacy and intensity. His figures are modeled not through shadow, but through pure color and rhythmic line, giving them the clarity of sculpture and the weightlessness of vision. The dragon's anatomy, both human and inhuman, shows Blake's study of classical form fused with visionary imagination. The composition is built vertically, forcing the eye upward from the writhing beast to the vast wings that dominate the sky, mirroring the ascent of Revelation itself. An interesting fact, Blake's red dragon paintings were later rediscovered in the 20th century and became cultural icons of visionary art. Their haunting imagery influenced writers and filmmakers, most famously inspiring Thomas Harris's novel Red Dragon and its later adaptations. Yet, in Blake's own context, they were works of devotion, meditations on spiritual warfare, not horror. Viewed today, the Great Red Dragon and the Beast from the Sea remains one of the most commanding images in Blake's mythology. It unites terror and majesty, faith and rebellion. The dragon does not simply represent evil. He is the shadow of creation itself, the energy that destroys because it cannot create rightly. In Blake's universe, imagination is divine, but without balance it becomes monstrous. The painting stands as both warning and revelation, that within the same light that gives life, darkness is always waiting to take form. Mask Still Life 3. On a dark table sit several carved faces, masks of wood and clay, arranged like fruit in a still life. Their colors are violent and earthy, crimson, ochre, black, and chalky white. Some grin with broken teeth, others stare blankly, hollow-eyed. The light falls unevenly, catching the edges of their noses and mouths, leaving the spaces between them in shadow. The background is dense with color, not space. The air itself feels heavy, almost feverish. What should be lifeless seems to pulse faintly, as if the masks might whisper once the viewer turns away. Emil Nolde painted Mask Still Life III around 1911 during his most experimental years as part of the German expressionist movement Die Brücke, the bridge. Born in 1867 in northern Germany, Nolde became known for his intense color, thick impasto, and fascination with what he saw as primal or spiritual imagery. While his contemporaries painted the urban life of modern Europe, Nolde turned towards symbols, rituals, and emotional extremes. The mask for him was not decoration, but revelation, a face freed from civility. The painting's context reflects early 20th century Europe's obsession with primitive art, particularly African and oceanic carvings which were being brought into Western museums at the time. Many expressionists, Nolde among them, saw in these objects a raw emotional authenticity they believed modern society had lost. Yet Mask Still Life 3 is not anthropology, it is projection. Nolde arranges the masks like a gathering of souls, their exaggerated expressions becoming psychological portraits. The scene feels both sacred and theatrical, part ritual, part nightmare. Symbolically, the painting explores identity and disintegration. The masks are not merely objects, but substitutes for people, each carrying a fragment of emotion: laughter, fear, rage, indifference. Their stillness becomes haunting, as if they are waiting to be worn. Nolde's choice to present them as a still life, a genre associated with fruit, flowers, or domestic objects, adds unease. It suggests that emotion itself can be collected, displayed, or wrought. Through this arrangement, Nolde transforms expressionist color into a language of psychology: red for blood and vitality, yellow for spiritual light, black for decay. Technically, the painting demonstrates Nolde's characteristic use of pure, unblended pigment applied in thick, textured strokes. The brushwork is rough, impulsive, and direct, no attempt at polish or illusion. The color creates volume instead of line. Form dissolves into energy. The background, a field of mixed reds and browns, traps the masks in an atmosphere of heat and confinement. There is no perspective, no horizon, only confrontation. An interesting fact: Nolde collected actual masks and sculptures from Africa, Oceania, and New Guinea, which he kept in his studio. He saw them as truthful faces, expressions of humanity stripped of social disguise. Yet his interpretation, like that of many expressionists, was shaped by European romanticism rather than genuine understanding of the cultures that created them. Mask Still Life 3 thus reflects both artistic admiration and cultural projection, a psychological mirror rather than an ethnographic study. Viewed today, Mask Still Life 3 stands as one of the key works in Nolde's exploration of the human face as symbol. It captures the paradox at the heart of expressionism, a desire to reach pure emotion through distortion, to find the soul by abandoning realism. In the flickering light and rough color, the masks seem alive, yet without humanity, a chorus of emotions that no longer belong to anyone. The painting becomes not just a still life, but a seance, a gathering of spirits painted in color and silence. Hell. At the bottom of the panel, a monstrous red demon stands amid flames, its wings stretched like black sails. Around it, the damned fall into a lake of fire, their bodies twisted in despair. Demons, part human, part beast, drag them downward with claws and chains. The heat of the scene glows through red, orange, and gold, yet the composition is perfectly ordered. The chaos of damnation unfolds with the same precision as a cathedral altarpiece. Every gesture, every flame is part of a vast moral design. This image forms the right wing of Hans Memling's Last Judgment triptych, painted between 1467 and 1471 for the Medici banker Angelo Tani, who commissioned it for the chapel of the Badia Fiessolana near Florence. Memling, born in Seligenstadt around 1430 and active in Bruges, was one of the great masters of the Northern Renaissance. His painting combined the detail of Jan van Eyck with the calm order of Rogier van der Weyden, his teacher's generation. The Last Judgment, now housed in the National Museum in Gdansk, Poland, remains one of his largest and most complex works. The triptych shows Christ as judge in the central panel, surrounded by angels and saints. On the left wing, the blessed ascend toward heaven, guided by angels in serene light. On the right wing, hell opens beneath a burning sky. Here, Memling depicts the fall of the damned, sinners tumbling headfirst into the open jaws of a monstrous beast. This wing was never meant to stand alone. It completes the moral symmetry of the altarpiece. Salvation balanced by punishment, grace by consequence. Contextually, the painting reflects late 15th century devotional thought in the Burgundian Netherlands. Artists such as Memling created altarpieces not as visions of terror, but as instruments of meditation. Hell was not designed to frighten. It was a visual sermon about order and divine justice. Every sinner is judged precisely according to deed. Even the flames are painted with mathematical rhythm, each figure perfectly modeled. The message is not chaos but balance. God's universe is structured, even in condemnation. Symbolically, Memling's hell represents sin as disintegration, a loss of harmony mirrored in the body's contortions. The monstrous figure at the center embodies evil as consumption. The creature devours souls endlessly, yet remains unsatisfied. The architecture of the inferno mirrors Gothic structure, arches of fire replacing stone, implying that hell is the mirror image of heaven, the same divine geometry turned inward. The damned are not nameless. Their faces show distinct individual expressions, emphasizing personal responsibility rather than collective doom. Technically, Memling used oil on oak panel, applying translucent layers of paint to create radiant depth. His reds and oranges retain their glow centuries later, balanced by blue shadows that cool the infernal light. The figures are small but sculptural, rendered with microscopic care, each demon and soul painted with the precision of a portrait. Light in the painting functions symbolically. Divine illumination from above meets the burning reflection of hell below, forming a perfect visual axis of judgment. An important detail, the Last Judgment was intercepted at sea in 1473 by Hanseatic pirates while being transported to Italy. The painting was taken to Gdansk and installed in St. Mary's Church, where it remained for centuries before entering the National Museum. Its survival is extraordinary. Despite wars and thefts, it remains nearly intact, with its brilliant colors and gilded frame preserved. Viewed today, Memling's Hell is one of the clearest visions of moral order in Northern Renaissance art. It is not a spectacle of horror, but of justice, a meticulously balanced vision of consequence. In his calm precision, Memling transforms eternal punishment into a form of divine architecture, terrifying, beautiful, and exact. Hypnos. A tall, shadowed figure looms over a young man, whose head is tilted back in surrender. From the dark figure's eyes bursts a thin beam of white light, striking the youth's face like a silent command. Between them, pale flowers glow faintly, fragile, living forms surrounded by the weight of stillness. The background is empty and dark, so that the two bodies and the single line of light become the entire world. The moment feels suspended, neither violent nor tender, but charged with invisible power. Sascha Schneider created Hypnos in 1904. Born in 1870 in Silesia, Schneider was a German symbolist painter and sculptor, fascinated by the tension between spirit and body. He trained at the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts and became known for his idealized male figures, human forms used as symbols of inner strength, fear, or revelation. At the turn of the 20th century, science and mysticism were colliding. Hypnosis, psychology, and the unconscious fascinated artists and thinkers alike. Schneider transformed those ideas into image, showing not the act of hypnosis as experiment, but as an allegory of control and awakening. The composition shows two opposing forces, will and submission, darkness and light. The standing figure represents domination through vision, power that comes not from muscle, but from mind. The reclining youth becomes a vessel for that energy, his body relaxed, his face illuminated. The beam of light between them joins the physical and the spiritual, a bridge between thought and matter. The small white flowers at their feet complete the cycle, hinting that even in surrender there is renewal, that consciousness can destroy but also transform. Hypnos is an etching with aquatint, a medium that allowed Schneider to move between sharp line and misted tone. The darkness around the dominant figure is dense and velvety, the light on the youth's body soft and precise. The flesh looks almost sculpted, but the air around it vibrates with tension. The technique mirrors the subject itself, control held in balance with dissolution. An interesting detail is the ambiguity of the scene. The older figure could be a hypnotist, a deity, a demon, or simply the embodiment of will. The youth could be a victim or a disciple. Schneider leaves no answer, only the exchange of energy between them, a wordless image of influence and surrender. Viewed today, Hypnos captures the atmosphere of early modern anxiety, the fear that the mind can be overpowered by unseen forces, and the fascination with that very loss of control. Schneider turns that fear into something monumental and quiet. The beam of light becomes more than a symbol of hypnosis. It becomes the line between knowledge and oblivion, between seeing and being seen. A figure with meat. A man sits on a throne-like chair, his body tense, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream. Behind him hang two massive carcasses of beef, sides of red flesh suspended by hooks, their forms framing him like wings or curtains. The background is dark and airless, the floor barely visible, the light stark and unnatural. The colors, raw crimson, bruised purple, and sickly yellow, vibrate with unease. The figure's suit is neat, his posture formal, yet the expression is one of unbearable distortion. The space feels both sacred and butchered, a chapel made of meat. Francis Bacon painted Figure with Meat in 1954 during one of his most intense creative periods. Born in Dublin in 1909, Bacon was a self-taught artist who made the human body the central subject of his art, not as beauty, but as vulnerability. By the mid-20th century, Europe was still processing the aftermath of 2 world wars, and Bacon's paintings captured that sense of existential ruin. The seated figure in this work is unmistakably derived from Diego Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent VI, 1650, which Bacon obsessively reinterpreted throughout his career. But here, the Pope has been stripped of sanctity. Surrounded by slaughtered carcasses, he becomes a man trapped between power and decay. The context of the painting reflects Bacon's fascination with religious imagery and the fragility of authority. In Velázquez's original, the Pope's pose radiates divine control. In Bacon's version, that control collapses. The hanging meat behind the throne recalls both Christian altarpieces and butchers' stalls, a deliberate confusion of sacred and mundane. The figure's open mouth echoes both the silent cry of Bacon's other portraits and the imagery of sacrifice. The scene resembles a twisted Eucharist. Instead of salvation through flesh, there is only flesh itself. Symbolically, Figure with Meat reduces human existence to its most physical state. The raw meat behind the Pope reflects mortality, appetite, and the body's inevitable corruption. The throne suggests power, but the figure's scream erases dignity. Bacon once said that he painted the brutality of fact, and here, fact is not horror, but the unavoidable truth that beneath every role and belief lies the same vulnerable matter. The symmetry of the hanging carcasses transforms them into dark wings, angels of flesh that guard no heaven. Technically, Bacon used oil on canvas, with thick, smeared brushwork that mimics motion and instability. The background is flat, isolating the figure in a cage-like composition. Bacon often worked from photographs rather than live models, studying images of popes, screaming faces, and butchered meat to construct his hybrid visions. The figure's form seems to flicker between presence and disappearance, as if dissolving under the weight of its own material. An interesting detail, Bacon was a regular visitor to London's meat markets and kept books of anatomical photographs and medical imagery in his studio. He often compared the human body to meat, not as dehumanization, but as acknowledgement of what we are. He admired Velázquez's composition but refused to see the original, claiming that its perfection might paralyze him. Viewed today, Figure with Meat stands as one of Bacon's most powerful meditations on mortality and faith. It strips away ceremony and reveals the trembling body beneath authority, The man who should represent the divine sits framed by death, his voice caught between scream and silence. Bacon turns the traditional image of spiritual triumph into a vision of human truth, fragile, bloody, and real. Human Laundry, Belsen, April 1945. In a long, narrow room lined with wooden tables, figures move quietly under harsh artificial light. British nurses and orderlies, their sleeves rolled up, bend over rows of emaciated survivors laid on stretchers. Some are being washed, others wrapped in clean blankets. Buckets of water, towels, and sheets cover the floor. The color is drained, whites, grays, and dull browns, yet everything glows faintly, as if illuminated by the effort to restore life. The title, Human Laundry, is literal. This was the place where survivors of Bergen-Belsen were washed, disinfected, and treated after the camp's liberation. Doris Zinkeisen painted Human Laundry, Belsen, April 1945, soon after visiting the newly liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. Born in Scotland in 1898, Zinkeisen was a painter, costume designer, and official British Red Cross war artist during the final months of the Second World War. She arrived at Belsen in April 1945 with the British Red Cross and St. John War Organization, sent to document the medical relief efforts taking place in the camp's aftermath. What she witnessed was not battle, but its consequence. Mass suffering, starvation, and the struggle to save those who had survived. The context of the painting reflects a precise historical moment. When British forces entered Belsen on the 15th of April 1945, they found over 60,000 prisoners still alive and tens of thousands of unburied corpses. British medical units and volunteers worked under extreme conditions to clean, feed, and treat the survivors, most of whom were near death. The Human Laundry was an improvised delousing and bathing station set up by the Red Cross in a nearby German army barracks. Zinkeisen was assigned to record these operations, not for propaganda, but for the British War Artists Advisory Committee, to preserve an eyewitness record of what had happened. Symbolically, the painting is not about horror, but recovery. There are no guards, no weapons, no spectacle, only the exhausted compassion of those working to reverse catastrophe. The scene functions as both documentation and elegy, humanity reasserting itself through care. The title's cold phrasing, drawn from soldiers' slang, underscores the scale of dehumanization that had to be undone. People washed like objects simply because they were too weak to move. Zinkeisen captures that paradox with restraint. The machinery of sanitation becomes the means of restoring dignity. Technically, the painting was executed in oil on canvas, now held by the Imperial War Museum in London. Zinkeisen used a subdued palette of grays and muted flesh tones, emphasizing the stark lighting and clinical atmosphere. Her composition is measured, balanced, almost architectural, the long row of bodies leading the eye into depth, flanked by nurses whose faces remain calm but weary. She avoids sentimentality. Her realism is steady and unsparing. Every brushstroke conveys the exhaustion of care after horror. An important detail, Zinkeisen also produced a series of sketches at Belsen showing hospital tents, burial parties, and medical workers at their stations. Together, they form one of the earliest visual records made by a British eyewitness. She completed Human Laundry, Belsen later in 1945 from these studies, preserving the exact geometry of the space and the subdued discipline of the medical teams. Viewed today, Human Laundry, Belsen, April 1945 is one of the most significant paintings of post-liberation Europe. It stands not as sensationalism, but as testimony, an image of reconstruction rather than ruin. In its quiet order, Zinkeisen found a new kind of heroism, not victory in war, but the deliberate, methodical act of returning humanity to those from whom it had been stolen. The Mouth of Hell, Hours of Catherine of Cleves. A monstrous face dominates the miniature, a gigantic head with eyes wide and lips stretched, forming a fiery cavern that swallows the damned. Its mouth gapes open like a furnace door, lined with sharp teeth that double as the gates of the underworld. Within the throat of the beast, naked figures tumble amid flame and smoke. Demons prod them with spears, their bodies twisting in panic. Around the creature, angels and devils struggle for souls while tongues of fire curl upward into the darkness. Despite the terror, every detail is exquisitely controlled. The color of the flames, the pattern of gold leaf, the rhythm of movement, turning horror into precision. This illumination, known as the Mouth of Hell, comes from the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, one of the finest manuscripts of the Northern Renaissance, created around 1440 in Utrecht, the Netherlands. The anonymous artist, often called the Master of Catherine of Cleves, is regarded as one of the greatest Dutch illuminators of the 15th century. The manuscript was commissioned for Catherine of Cleves, Duchess of Guelders, a noblewoman renowned for her piety and taste. Its 157 miniatures form one of the most elaborate books of hours ever produced, a private devotional text where every page fuses religious teaching with artistic invention. The Mouth of Hell scene illustrates part of the Office of the Dead, a set of prayers reminding the reader of mortality and the need for salvation. In medieval theology, the mouth was the traditional image of hell's entrance, a living monster consuming sinners, as described in the Book of Isaiah and popularized in medieval mystery plays. Here, the artist turns that symbol into a vivid miniature apocalypse, humanity swallowed by its own corruption. The faces of the condemned are individualized, not anonymous. Each expression registers the same realization, that judgment has come and cannot be escaped. Symbolically, the illumination reflects the medieval idea of moral order as architecture. Hell is not chaos, but structure, a vast, infernal machine where sin finds its fitting punishment. The monstrous mouth stands for both temptation and consequence. The same opening through which words, food, and desire enter the world now becomes the gate of destruction. The fires inside are painted not as random flame, but as patterned geometry, proof that even torment obeys divine design. For a 15th century reader, the image was not fantasy, but instruction, a vision to meditate upon before sleep or prayer, a warning painted in gold. Technically, the Mouth of Hell reveals the miniature's extraordinary craftsmanship. The artist used tempera, ink, and gold leaf on vellum, building color through countless transparent layers. Reds and oranges create the heat of flame, while delicate highlights of white and gold give the fire a metallic gleam. The beast's head, green and scaly, is modeled with subtle shading that gives it dimensional presence, even at a few centimeters in size. The borders, filled with decorative vines, flowers, and small grotesques, frame the horror like a jewel. Beauty containing terror. An interesting detail: the Hours of Catherine of Cleves was rediscovered in the 20th century after being separated into 2 volumes for centuries. When reunited, scholars realized that its treatment of hell, purgatory, and heaven formed a complete moral cycle, from fall to redemption. The Mouth of Hell stands as the darkest and most visually striking of these images, rivaling much larger paintings in imaginative force. Viewed today, The Mouth of Hell, Hours of Catherine of Cleves, is one of the most concentrated depictions of damnation in Western art, only a few inches wide, yet vast in its vision. It turns fear into order, horror into meditation. For its original reader, it was not merely art but instruction, a reminder that salvation begins with awareness and that even in miniature, the abyss can stare back. Works of Leon Golub. Leon Golub's paintings confront the viewer with unflinching directness. Monumental canvases filled with figures caught in acts of domination, interrogation, and control. His brushwork is raw and scraped. His colors, ochre, red, black, flesh tones, seem rubbed into the surface rather than painted on it. The men who populate his images wear uniforms, carry weapons, or stand in shadow. Victims appear half-naked, twisted, or slumped. The backgrounds are bare, often scraped down to raw canvas. Nothing is hidden, and nothing is redeemed. Leon Golub was born in Chicago in 1922 and came of age in the aftermath of the Second World War. He studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he and his wife, the painter Nancy Sparrow, developed a lifelong partnership devoted to politically engaged art. In the 1950s and 1960s, when abstraction dominated American painting, Golub pursued figurative work that addressed power, violence, and history. His influences ranged from classical relief sculpture to modern photojournalism. His subject was always the human body under pressure. The context of his mature work emerged from the Cold War, the Vietnam conflict, and the global politics of the late 20th century. Golub's series Vietnam, 1972 to 1975, Interrogation, 1980s, and Mercenaries, 1980 to 1985, exposed the machinery of political and military violence. These works do not describe specific events. They show systems, men carrying out power, obeying orders, inflicting pain. Golub once said that he wanted to paint the drama of power, not its justification. His figures inhabit a moral void, soldiers, torturers, and mercenaries performing their roles in settings stripped of heroism. Symbolically, Golub's art deals with exposure. He eliminates narrative and decoration, leaving the essential relationship between oppressor and victim. The peeling surfaces of his canvases, sanded, scored, and rubbed, evoke wounds, erasures, and memory. Flesh becomes landscape. Texture replaces beauty. The scale of his paintings is monumental, forcing viewers to stand before figures nearly life-sized, as though they were witnesses rather than spectators. Unlike propaganda, Golub's work never instructs, it implicates. His technique is deliberately rough and physical. He worked in acrylic on unprimed canvas, scraping away paint with knives and rags to achieve a dry, scarred surface. The color fields are uneven, giving the figures a ghostly presence. Golub's palette alternates between flesh tones and rust reds, the colors of earth and blood, creating a constant tension between realism and abstraction. His process mirrored his subject, the act of painting as confrontation. An interesting fact, in the 1990s, after decades of political conflict and public indifference, Golub's tone shifted slightly. Works such as White Squad and Riot retained their intensity, but introduced irony and psychological distance. His later paintings, political portraits and banners, used text, myth, and humor to reflect on mortality and the aging artist's perspective on power. He remained active until his death in 2004, still painting large-scale works that combined mythic imagery with contemporary violence. Viewed as a whole, the works of Leon Golub form one continuous statement about the nature of power and its marks on the body. His art refuses abstraction as escape, demanding that the human face and form remain visible even in their degradation. In Golub's universe, violence is not spectacle but system, persistent, organized, and ordinary. The scraped paint and rough surface embody the erosion of moral certainty in the modern age. His paintings do not offer comfort, they offer endurance, the stubborn persistence of the human figure within history's darkest rooms. Works of Jaroslav Panushka. Jaroslav Panushka's art exists on the edge between folklore and nightmare. His landscapes are dark and skeletal, dead trees under pale skies, ruined cottages, barren fields where mist hangs low to the ground. In these empty spaces, human figures appear like ghosts, a wandering monk, a witch, a skeletal horseman, or a peasant frozen in terror. The colors are muted, gray, brown, and sepia, yet the atmosphere vibrates with unease. Panushka painted not horror as spectacle, but dread as weather, a world where the supernatural is part of the landscape itself. Born in Hojovice, Bohemia in 1872, Jaroslav Panushka studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague under Julius Majak, one of the leading Czech landscape painters. At first, he followed the traditions of naturalism and romantic realism, painting forests, rivers, and rural life. But around the 1890s, his work took a darker turn. Influenced by Slavic mythology, ghost stories, and the symbolist movement, he began to fill his landscapes with visions of the uncanny, skeletons, demons, and spirits rendered with startling clarity. This transformation marked him as one of the few Czech painters who combined academic technique with the psychological depth of symbolism. The context of his work reflects the late 19th century fascination with death, decay, and the supernatural, themes explored across Europe in literature and art. In Bohemia, these interests took on a distinctly rural form. Panushka's monsters are not from distant myth, but from local legend. Forest demons, ghosts of the drowned, spirits haunting abandoned villages. His paintings translate oral folklore into visual allegory. The supernatural becomes a metaphor for memory, guilt, and the slow passing of old worlds under industrial modernity. Symbolically, Panushka's art is a dialogue between life and afterlife. The dead are not entirely gone. They linger among the living as echoes of conscience and history. In works such as The Skeleton's Meeting, The Haunted Mill, and The Spirit of the Forest, he turns decay into presence. His use of perspective and light creates both physical space and psychological depth, a horizon that feels endless, yet closed. The figures, often skeletal or monstrous, are painted with empathy rather than fear. They seem weary, bound by the same solitude that defines the living. Technically, Panushka worked in oil, watercolor, and ink, often on small panels or paper. His brushwork is fine and deliberate, building atmosphere through subtle gradations rather than detail. He achieved his eerie luminosity by layering thin washes of gray and brown over pale grounds, giving his scenes a misty translucence. The result is a world neither day nor night, a liminal zone where the boundaries between matter and spirit dissolve. An interesting fact, Panushka was known in his lifetime for his eccentricity. Locals in his later years called him the Hermit of Kochanov, after the village where he lived in isolation, surrounded by woods that often became the subjects of his art. Though his reputation faded after his death in 1958, his work has since been rediscovered as a precursor to Czech surrealism and dark romanticism. Modern audiences see in his ghosts and ruins not superstition, but psychological truth, the persistence of the past in the landscape of the present. Viewed as a whole, the works of Yaroslav Panushka form a haunting map of the Central European imagination. They merge folklore, death, and solitude into a single vision of the world after faith, but before forgetting. His spirits and skeletons do not frighten, they endure. In their quiet presence, Panushka reveals that the supernatural is not outside of us. It is the memory that refuses to die, still walking through the fields of the living. Works of Zoran Mušić. Across Zoran Mušić's canvases, the human figure appears faint, almost erased. Thin bodies lying on the ground, faces reduced to shadows, color drained to dust. The surface seems worn, as if memory itself were losing its strength. His lines are delicate and hesitant, his palette subdued. Grays, ochres, and pale reds, the colors of soil and bone. Each painting looks as though it has been exhumed rather than painted. The world he depicts is quiet, stripped of drama, yet unbearably human. Zoran Mušić was born in 1909 in Bukovica, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and became one of the most significant Central European painters of the 20th century. A Slovene by origin, he studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Zagreb and spent much of his life in Italy. In 1944, he was arrested by the Gestapo and deported to the Dachau concentration camp, an experience that marked his entire artistic vision. After the war, he resumed painting in Venice, alternating between landscapes, portraits, and later, the haunting memory of the camp. The context of Mušić's work is divided between two worlds, the poetic and the traumatic. His early landscapes of Dalmatia and Italy show delicate hills and horses in motion, painted with warm, translucent color. But from the late 1940s onward, his palette cooled, his brush grew restrained, and human figures began to disappear into abstraction. In the 1970s, 3 decades after Dachau, he returned to those memories with the series Nous ne sommes pas les derniers, We Are Not the Last. These works, painted from recollection, show piles of corpses lying in a gray expanse, each figure reduced to line and dust. There are no guards, no walls, no action, only stillness, the echo of human absence. Symbolically, Mušić's art is about survival through witnessing. He paints what remains, after meaning has collapsed, the trace, the imprint, the residue of life. His concentration camp figures are not portraits of suffering, but of silence. They exist between memory and erasure, between testimony and disappearance. The title, We Are Not the Last, suggests that the horror he saw was not an exception, but a warning, that history's violence repeats itself. Through minimal color and skeletal form, Mušić gives the inexpressible a shape that is fragile, but enduring. Technically, Mušić's work is distinguished by restraint. He often used thin oil or tempera layers on rough canvas or paper, letting the texture show through the paint. The surface appears dry, almost powdered, emphasizing the fragility of the image. His line is delicate but deliberate, a single stroke suggesting both contour and dissolution. Even when he painted landscapes or Venetian interiors, the same austerity remained. Light as dust, forms as memory. His method reveals an artist for whom beauty and desolation could no longer be separated. An interesting fact, in interviews, Mušić rarely spoke about Dachau directly, saying that he painted only what I had to. He continued working into his 90s, returning repeatedly to the same subjects: the reclining figures, the empty horizons, the muted color fields. His late self-portraits show an old man fading into the same gray that filled his earlier canvases, as if his life and his art had merged into one long act of remembrance. Viewed together, the works of Zoran Mušić form a meditation on endurance and disappearance. He painted not the spectacle of suffering, but its aftermath, the silence left behind when words fail. In his thin, trembling lines lies the memory of those who could not speak. His art, fragile and restrained, reminds us that witness is not noise, but persistence, the quiet act of remembering when the world prefers to forget. Works of Hyman Bloom. Hyman Bloom's paintings seem to breathe between beauty and decay. Flesh, fabric, and light dissolve into one another, glowing reds, ochres, and purples forming images that hover between the sacred and the anatomical. His brushwork is dense, his color luminous, his subjects unsettling. Cadavers, rabbis, candles, angels, and trees that look like nerves or veins. The result is a vision where death and revelation share the same space, physical matter transformed by spiritual intensity. Born in Latvia in 1913 and raised in Boston after immigrating to the United States, Hyman Bloom emerged in the 1930s and 1940s as one of the leading figures of American Expressionism before the rise of Abstract Expressionism. Alongside artists like Jack Levine and Carl Zerbe, he was part of the group sometimes called the Boston Expressionists, painters who rejected pure abstraction in favor of intense psychological figuration. His work fused Jewish mysticism, European symbolism, and modern painterly energy into a single visual language. The context of Bloom's art is deeply personal. During the 1940s, he began visiting anatomy laboratories and morgues, studying the human body in decay. These encounters produced some of his most controversial works, such as Corpse, Front View, 1944, Corpse of a Woman, 1947, and Female Corpse, Back View, 1947. Far from sensationalism, Bloom saw in the dissection of flesh a spiritual revelation, the body as both matter and mystery. At a time when most American painters were turning toward abstraction, he confronted mortality directly, treating decomposition not as horror, but as transfiguration. Symbolically, Bloom's paintings transform the physical into the metaphysical. His corpses, tangled branches, and ritual interiors all describe the same process: energy leaving the material world. Flesh becomes landscape, light becomes substance. In his Jewish-themed works, such as Rabbis with Torahs in Synagogue, the spiritual ecstasy of worship mirrors the transformation of his anatomical scenes. Both are acts of revelation, the discovery of divine presence within matter. Bloom's color, glowing like stained glass or candlelight, conveys that fusion of life and death, body and spirit. Technically, Bloom used thick, layered oil paint, applied with heavy brushes and palette knives. His surfaces are rich and tactile, almost sculptural. He often built compositions from swirling, organic forms that merge figure and background into one field of motion. In his later years, he turned to drawings and mixed media works, exploring similar themes of energy, disintegration, and regeneration. Even his still lifes, flowers, candles, chandeliers, carry the same tension between brilliance and decay. An important fact: though admired by critics like Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, Bloom remained outside the New York avant-garde. He avoided self-promotion, living quietly in New Hampshire and Boston. In the 1950s, as abstract expressionism became dominant, his reputation faded, but later decades brought renewed attention. Exhibitions in the 2000s revealed the full range of his vision, from early mystical interiors to the monumental seances and angels of his final years. Viewed as a whole, the works of Hyman Bloom form a meditation on transformation, the passage from flesh to light. He painted the body not as object, but as vessel, matter illuminated by spirit, decay as revelation. In his canvases, the physical world does not end, it changes state. What remains is motion, color, and the quiet realization that beauty can exist even where life has already gone. Works of Jack Kevorkian. Jack Kevorkian's paintings occupy a strange territory between surrealism, psychology, and moral allegory. His canvases are filled with dreamlike figures, skeletal bodies, floating eyes, disembodied hands, and trapped human forms suspended in empty landscapes. The colors are muted and uncomfortable, pale greens, yellows, and blood-like reds against shadowy backgrounds. The technique is deliberate but rough, the mood tense and claustrophobic. Each image looks like a moral puzzle, an expression of confinement, fear, and transformation within the human body. Jack Kevorkian, born in Michigan in 1928, was trained as a pathologist, but became best known in the 1990s as a controversial advocate of assisted dying. Long before his notoriety as Dr. Death, however, he painted extensively. His art was never meant for public exhibition. It emerged as private reflection, a way to visualize the ideas that haunted him: mortality, autonomy, and the limits of compassion. His paintings were mostly created in the 1960s and 1970s, well before his later fame, and reveal a mind preoccupied with the intersection of ethics, suffering, and the body. The context of Kevorkian's art lies between medical experience and existential inquiry. As a doctor, he had spent years studying anatomy and observing death directly. As an artist, he translated that knowledge into metaphors. His works resemble a fusion of medical illustration and symbolist painting. The human figure is often trapped in mechanical or organic structures, veins, ropes, metallic cages, suggesting the conflict between the body's biology and the spirit's will. Titles like Coma, Nearer My God to Thee, and The Gourmet hint at moral struggle beneath the surface image. Symbolically, Kevorkian's paintings function as meditations on control and release. The human body, rendered as both vessel and prison, represents consciousness caught between life and dissolution. In Coma, a body hangs limply in space, half consumed by darkness. In Genie, out of the bottle, a distorted figure bursts upward in a spiral of smoke and color, a symbol of liberation through destruction. Many of his works portray the human form stretched or fragmented, as if depicting the soul's attempt to escape physical boundaries. Technically, Kevorkian painted in oil on canvas, favoring high contrast and bold outlines. The influence of surrealists such as Dalí and early expressionists is evident, though his execution is more direct, even primitive. He worked quickly, often without preparatory sketches, focusing on emotional impact rather than formal perfection. The compositions are centered and frontal, the figures emerging against dark voids. This simplicity amplifies the psychological charge. The viewer's attention is fixed entirely on the image of suffering or revelation. An interesting fact, Kevorkian's art was exhibited publicly only after his legal battles in the 1990s, when interest in his personal philosophy grew. In 1994, several of his paintings were shown in New York under the title The Doctor Is In, revealing the depth of his symbolic imagination. He described his art as philosophical, not political, claiming it expressed the dark side of the human condition, the suffering that precedes release. A few of the paintings were later sold at auction, some reproductions used to fund legal expenses. Viewed as a whole, the works of Jack Kevorkian reveal an artist deeply conscious of mortality and ethics. They are not decorative or comforting. They are confrontations with the physical and moral limits of human life. The imagery oscillates between despair and transcendence, the human figure torn but still luminous. For Kevorkian, art was another form of inquiry. A place where the doctor and the philosopher could meet, where anatomy became allegory, and where the fragile body was shown not as failure, but as the instrument of its own release.